Hello everybody, this is lesson 5, Introduction to JavaScript, part 3. And what?
Episode 6.
Is it episode 6? I don't think so.
Yeah,
Really?
Sure.
yeah. My notes are numbered.
Really? Okay, well, let's change that. Let's start over. Hello everybody, this is lesson 6, Introduction to JavaScript, part 3. Sorry about that. I thought I was going by order. I guess I might have just missed one or something. I don't know. But I guess I got to change the title on the stream too. Let me do that. Part 6. Save. Okay, good. All right. And so first off, I want to kind of go like between last lesson and this lesson. Last lesson we covered a lot of the we cover some more JavaScript things. We cover iterations, which is, again, as I said on the last lesson, like one of the most complicated parts of programming in general. So today we're going to cover functions, and if we have time, we'll go into event listeners for HTML, but we probably won't have time to get into that, I'm assuming. So it'll probably be straight about functions now. We're going to kind of start off. I want to kind of show off a little bit what Nora was able to do here. Nora is one of the people on the call with us here, learning from the small group. And I'm kind of trying to speak to a more wider audience now, because one thing that I notice is between every video that we've put out, we have more and more views, both on Twitch and on YouTube. So we have a couple of people who are seem to be interested in this stuff as well, so that's pretty cool. I'm glad I decided to make this public, because anybody that we can help with this stuff along the way and help people help people get to the point where they can actually code, that would be pretty cool. So anyway, so she made this little JavaScript counter, just 3 simple buttons: increase, decrease, reset. But pretty cool. I really do like seeing you guys come up with little things like this between sessions. It just means a lot to me that I'm actually able to get some of this stuff across and you guys are able to use it. And it's also this color changer here that just, I don't know, I actually have not looked at the code. I'm going to look at it later. I'm not going to do it now. Kind of curious as to what's actually picking which color to choose. Is it like random from an array? Is it going in a list? I'll find out.
Yeah, no, it's random from an array.
Oh, okay. That's cool. That's cool. That's what I thought. Interesting. So that's pretty cool. But we're going to spend a lot of time on here, but again, we're going to spend most of our time on the actual console instead of looking at that page that we made a few days ago, because I don't even remember what the structure here is. I just know we have like a lot of sample HTML tags in there, and we're going to do some stuff with that eventually, but today we're going to focus on functions. So everything uses a function. So just to kind of very quickly reiterate something that we went over on the last session, is we talked about maps, right? So if you have an array, and let me just assign a quick array. I'm going to assign a quick array with the numbers 1, 2, 3 as values, right? So there's our array. Array 1, 2, 3 are the values. And we talked about map, right? So you can do array map, and then you can like assign a variable, and this is why I quickly described it as an arrow function, right? And then which number will represent each individual element as you go through it, and then you can go and do something or whatever you want with that variable as the variable changes values on each iteration. So if you remember that, cool. If you don't remember that, that's something to kind of go over the last lesson. But we will talk more into we will definitely cover iterations in a deeper level again eventually. But for now, we're going to move on. So that I just want to kind of talk about what this means over here, right? So this is an arrow function. Now, an arrow function is very similar to a normal function. Now, a normal function, if you remember from the first JavaScript lesson, we write it kind of like, so let's just say function. This is like going to be the name of the function. I'm just going to call it my function, right? This here is whatever you name it. Doesn't matter what. And you can do and then you write your code in here, right? So this is my code, and now we've created essentially a variable called my function, which represents that function. And if you want to invoke that function, you do it with the open close parentheses, and it'll go and run the actual function, So that's something we covered on the first lesson. So an arrow function is basically the same concept, is written a little bit differently in the way that the scope for a how do I explain this? So the scope for an arrow function is a little different, right? And this is gonna go more into once you're into modern JavaScript and you're in a class, or you're actually looking at a function within an object. That's where the scope really matters. So we're not gonna talk too much about the scoping right now. We're just gonna focus on the body of the function itself. So notice that here, like when we're looking at this function here, let me make this a little bigger if I can. Okay, so when we're looking at this, the syntax for this function here, it's gonna be function, the name, open close parentheses, and this is the reason why this is here, the open and close parentheses, is because this is where your parameters go. Okay, and then the squiggly brackets is just the body of the function, or the code block for what the code that goes inside of the function. So an arrow function is basically the same. So let me call the arrow function my function 2, right? So if I'm gonna write a function like this, my function 2, and do the same thing, and I'm just gonna console log this as my code just like the other one. If I'm writing an arrow function instead, it's going to look like var my function 2, right? Because we're just assigning a variable, and then we're gonna say equals, and here is when you can go ahead and assign your arrow function just like that. Now notice that I did open close parentheses, and I just went ahead and put the block, and here I'm gonna say console log this is my code. So at the end of the day, writing the function like this and writing the function like this gave me the same results. If I run my function 2, it'll just run the function, right? There's nothing different about it. It's essentially the same thing. Now, what makes an arrow function interesting is if you're going to give one parameter. This is when we start covering parameters, right? When you're only going to have one parameter, you don't need to put your parentheses in. So here's a different way to write map, so this can make a little bit more sense. So there's the array, right? So the same thing we did here with an arrow function, I'm going to do this with the normal function syntax, where instead of just saying arrow function parameter number do that, I'm going to actually go ahead and say function number do that, right? And we got an error. What did I miss? Arrow function open. Let's figure out what we miss here. Squiggly bracket, that's the end of the map. Missing something before function body. Okay, I'm writing something wrong here. Let's look. I actually always use the arrow function syntax when I write a map. So let me see if I can find a quick sample of it using the standard function, because it's been a while. I'm not sure what it is that I'm doing wrong. Well, that's JavaScript array map. See if we got a quick sample of it somewhere here. Okay, so I mean that's basically what I wrote. At least I thought. Okay, let's write it from scratch. Okay, I'm pretty sure I wrote it like that. So array.map, and then function, and then this is the body of the. Oh, I can't. Okay, I'm sorry. I see what I did wrong. So what I did wrong, I'm just gonna go ahead and rewrite that the way I wrote it. I kept this arrow here, and obviously the arrow is what's the major difference between writing it the normal way and writing it as a normal function. So this is the syntax of a normal function, as we see up here: function name, etc. Right? So this is like how a normal function would be written, and this would output exactly the same thing as the arrow function version of it. There are now. Again, we're going to cover the scopes of why these functions are different and how to write it in future when we're getting into classes. But for now, the main thing to understand is arrow functions is a little newer, and it's easier to write an arrow function, as there's like, you don't have to put the word function, you know, and as long as you see, basically if you see this fat arrow, and the reason why we call it a fat arrow is because it's like prefixed with an equal sign. So if you see this fat arrow, whoops, I don't know what I clicked there, fat arrow, and then next to it you see an open close or just an open squiggly bracket and there's code inside it, you're basically looking at an arrow function, where with what comes before this is your list of parameters, right? And I keep repeating parameters, but I have yet to explain what parameters means in a function. And now this is where functions get interesting, and this is the main thing to cover about functions. So we're going to stick to arrow functions because in modern JavaScript that's what you're going to use more. You can still declare functions like this if you want, like function, you know, whatever you want to call your function, and you can still declare it like that in JavaScript, and in some cases you will, right? But in most cases, what I would rather see is the name of the variable, so it makes more sense, right? And if you remember the terrible box example that I used on the first lesson, but whatever you want to call it, and then just basically use an arrow function syntax, which is just going to be open close parentheses, and that's where your parameters go, fat arrow, and then your code block. So it's just that simple how you would write an arrow function and how you would name your arrow function. But now let's talk about parameters. So I'm going to say param1 and param2. Now, what you're putting here in these parentheses, just like how you name your variables, this is like when you're declaring your function, it's whatever you want it to be, right? Like you can name these whatever you want. Now, normally you will name it according to what the code is supposed to do, so that when you're reading the code it makes sense. So like, let's just say for instance I'm going to make a mathematical function. Let's say I want to do a function to add one number to another number, right? So I'm going to call the function add. Actually, I'm just going to call it add. So here I'm going to say number 1, and then here I'm going to say number 2. So my first parameter is called number 1, my second parameter is called number 2. Now the body of my function, I'm going to say console.log number 1 plus number 2. So that's the answer. Now again, remember, all I've done here is declare a function, right? Like, this is not actually executing any code, this is not doing anything. I basically made a variable called add, which is basically this function. So now the variable has my result, and my result is this function here. I can do something with that variable. Now what happens if I try to just run my variable like this, right? Just add without specifying any parameters. Now because I'm actually trying to do something to the parameters inside of the function, you're going to get an undefined error because it's trying to add two things that don't exist. It's kind of like the same as if I try to do undefined plus undefined. Your answer is NaN. So NaN is something that you're going to see anytime that you have a mathematical operation that has an invalid result. If you try to add a string mathematically to a number, as we went over on the first lesson, is going to basically give it, it's just going to concatenate the string and the number together, and your result is a string. But if you're trying to add a number to something that doesn't exist, well, null has the value of 0, by the way, I just remembered that. But if you're trying to add something to something that is undefined, you're gonna get NaN. So like, if anytime that you're doing like a math operation with a lot of variables, if your result is NaN, then instantly you should know that something there is undefined, and that's why you're getting NaN. On the same note,
not a number.
Correct, that's exactly what it means. And another useful thing to think about with NaN is, so JavaScript has a built-in function called isNaN that you can use. So this is a built-in variable in JavaScript, that's this function called isNaN, and this function is actually going to return a boolean of true or false if whatever you put inside of it is not a number. So if you put like anything here, right, that's not a number, so it's going to say true. But if you put like an actual number, it's going to say false. So anytime that you need to check if something is a number for whatever reason, there's a couple of, so let's just kind of give a real world example. So say I want to make it so this function here that I created called add, right? So it's add number 1, add equals, and then I did arrow function number 1 and number 2. Say you want to validate, right? You, instead of just returning an error when it doesn't work, you want to create some checks to make sure that you're passing numbers in to this function before trying to do anything. So I can go ahead and I can say if if is nan number 1, right? I'll go ahead and say, and I'm going to actually break this down step by step, right? Because I don't want to confuse you guys. So this is an if statement. And if you remember the if statements that we went over last time, if the value is true, this is going to happen. And this is where in a function you can do this thing called a return. And we're gonna go over returns today in a little bit, though. I'm not gonna go over it now, but I'll just give you a brief explanation of what it means. Basically, when you're returning something in a function, you're halting the script and you're giving the result of the function. And I'll explain a little better in a little bit. But here we're gonna return an error, or actually we're gonna, you know what? Let's not return. Let's just throw. Okay. All right. You know, I'm sorry. Console. We'll do a console error and say number 1 is not a valid number. And here we're gonna whoops. And here we're going to return. And the reason why we're returning is because now we're ending this function operation, so it's not gonna bother to run this at all. It's not gonna go this far because you have a return, right? So now I can go and I can say add without anything, and it's going to tell me, well, I wrote it wrong. Whoops, let me fix that. So the N here is a capital N, is nan, like that. That's how you write it. Do that again. So now when you try to send something like this, it's going to give you the error, right? So this is the console error line that I just wrote. It says number 1 is not a valid number. So this is how you will do a custom error for something, right? If you want to output an error on your console in your code, console error is the way to go, and you're going to get number 1 is not a valid number. And you can write whatever you want. You can write there are no unicorns here. Doesn't matter what error message you want. Now obviously you want it to pertain to what the code is. You want it to kind of make sense, you know, but we know, because we're looking at this, that there are no unicorns here means that number 1 is not a valid number. So what if I give it a valid number for number 1, right? I'm gonna say add, and I'm gonna say 7. So 7 becomes my number 1. So when you're calling a function, basically what you're doing when you're sending parameters inside of your function is you're assigning the value of the variable that you declared the function with, the parameters. Really, that's the word you want to use. So this is basically means number 1 will equals the first thing you put in here, and number 2 will equal the second thing you put in here. So if I do 7 and 12, right, the answer to that, 7 plus 12 is 19. I just realized another mistake that I made here. When I wrote this function again, I did number 1 comma number 2. It should be comma number 1 plus number 2. Okay, so now if I do 7 and 12 like this, we're gonna get our answer 19. Because, so let's break down what's going on. You're doing add 7, 12. So when we're running through this function here, it's basically saying number 1 is going to be 7, number 2 is going to be 12. Then it checks to see, is number 1 a real number? If it is, if it's not a real number, you're gonna get this error, right? So if I run the same function again and I put, you know, some words here, we're gonna get that error. There are no unicorns here. Now notice that I only validated number 1. I didn't validate number 2. So what happens if I flip this around and I send this as a 7, and then I send this as like something that isn't a real number? It's going to concatenate, and that's not what you want, right? Because this is a mathematical function. So when we do this validation, you can validate for number 2 as well. So the most obvious and simple way to do this, like common sense, right? You already have all this code that checks number 1. You can go ahead and copy and paste this and check number 2. Now there's something very wrong with doing that, right? And let's just say we actually put real errors, and we say I'm gonna actually put the real error, number 1 is not valid, and number 2 is not valid. And both of these, now what happens is this one's gonna check. It's gonna check number 1 first because it reads the script from top to bottom. And if number 1 is a real number, it'll move on, and then it'll check number 2. And if number 2 is a real number, it'll move on. At any point, if they're not, it'll just stop and give us that error. So now if I say again, so now if I do add without anything, it's going to say number 1's not valid, but I didn't even send a number 1, right? Number 1's undefined. So if I do send a number 1 now, but I don't send a number 2, it's going to say number 2 is not valid. So if I send a valid number for number 2, now it's valid, now I got an answer. Or if I send something else that's not wrong, now it's valid, now it's not an answer. And technically this is correct, right? There's nothing wrong with this in terms of logic. But when you're writing code, you do want to try to simplify things as much as you can. I know that when we talked about if statements on the last lesson, I talked about how you can add, you can say and, right, and do more than one statement. So I can say and number 2. Now the problem is this logic doesn't quite capture what I want, because this is actually checking if number 1 is not a number and number 2 is not a number. If you think about that in English, we're saying if number 1 is not a number and number 2 is not a number. You're not covering a situation where one of them is a number and one is not. And let's go ahead and test that, right? So I just went ahead and submitted the function just like that. And also the error, right? Let me go back and say the error just says number 1 is invalid. So now I'm going to change the error to actually match the scenario. I'm going to say number 1 and number 2 must be valid. So now it's a better error message that kind of covers both scenarios. So now if you read its error, you know you need to check both numbers, not just one. But still, our logic here is only checking, it is actually checking to see if both of these numbers are not numbers, and it's only going to give us this error if they're both not numbers. So if I do add 7, 12, it'll work just fine as we expected. But if I do add 7, if I change the 7 to make the 7 something that doesn't exist, now we're not going to get the error because this is checking for both. So we want to return an error if either one of these are true, not both of them are true. So this is when we use the OR operator, and this is something that I kind of forgot to cover in the last lesson. So this is and, 2 pipe signs, and that's if you do shift pipe, which is the button right below backspace, if you've never seen or used that before. So this means OR in JavaScript. So now you're saying if this is not a number or this is not a number, then number 1 and number 2 must be valid. So it doesn't matter if either of these are true, it's going to go ahead and give us the error. Now we have a properly validated function, which if we send, if this is not a number and this is not a number, it's going to tell us that is not what we expected. Okay, hold on a second. Let's see here. So we're saying if this is true, or did I hit enter there? I think I did. If this is true or this is true, we should get this error. And if we didn't get this error, then I might be slightly retarded.
I have a question.
Hold on. Let me figure this out real quick, and then we'll go to questions. Okay. So first off, let's start with 2 real numbers. So 7 and 12. Okay, that works as expected. If this is not a number, okay, so our error is not happening. So let's find. So here's how you can debug this error to figure out why it's not happening. And right now it's not making, it's probably something really stupid, right? But because I'm trying to kind of come up with this example as I go, I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. So here is the value for number 1. I'm just gonna say nan number 1. So I'm console logging this to actually visually see what the results are here, right? So, and then number 2, nan number 2, nan number 1. It's going to tell me what I'm expecting, you know, in this example here, because they're both strings. I'm expecting this to be true and this to be true. Therefore, this should have happened. So let's see what happens. So add 2 strings. We got false and false. Okay, I see what's happening. It's because I am sending, so the function is nan will actually detect numbers inside of quotes. That's the problem, and that's something that I kind of forgot when I was going over it. So even though it is a string, it's still detecting it as a number. So it's not, so using is nan is great, but you do want to be careful, you know, if your parameter, if you're using it for validation, kind of like what I did here, and you don't want like strings to be a potential thing to use, then you need to do some extra validation. You need to check the type as well, and we kind of went over this in the first lesson as well. I think how different variables have different types. So another thing you want to add here to do this validation is, and you can actually add it to the same thing, you can say, you can make this whole block something here, right? So if this is true, or if this is true, and then that didn't do it, this is true, this is true. So now we have this huge block that checks to make sure that these are all like not real numbers. But then you actually have to also compare the type of number one. And you know, just to make this less confusing, I'm gonna separate this check into like a whole other check, right? I'm gonna copy and paste this like this, you know, because in this scenario I wouldn't want to nest too many things, because then it's just confusing to read. So for this I'm gonna say type of number equals number, and I'm sorry, string or not. Okay, so if type of number one is not a number, then or type of number two is not a number, and you can test this real quick. I'll show you guys how you can really quickly test what you expect. I'm going to give the same error, and then you can actually add these together. And I'm going to actually show you guys how you can simplify this in JavaScript to put all of these conditions in one big statement that with a lot less lines, right? So it's good that we ran into this problem. So let me just say enter here for now, but now I'm just going to test to make sure that the way I did this is correct. So if I do type of a string, it's going to say string, even though inside of the string it's a number. And if we do is nan, like we did before, the string, it's going to say false, even though it's a string and not a number type. So if you want to compare number type, you do want to do that way, right? So now if it's an actual number, which is what we expect, it's number. So the only thing that I messed up is it's lowercase n and not capital N the way I wrote it. So we can change that right here. And now let's just go over this logic step by step, right? So now it's going to go ahead and it's going to say if the type of the number one is not a number, if it's anything else except a number, because we only want a number, or the type of two is not a number, then we're going to give this error. Now we can go ahead and run this add function with actual numbers in here like this, and it'll give us the error. Number one and number two must be valid, right? Because the types are not going to match. So I'm getting to your question in a second, Scope. So now you can simplify this. Now remember, so these things here are conditions, right? So this you can write a condition like this. You can say type of this, right, is not a number, and the result of the condition will be true, right? Because that's not a number. You can assign a variable as a condition. So you can say valid, you can say variable valid number, or you can say like valid is, let me think about that for a sec. So we're checking if it's not a number. So we're going to say not number equals this condition, okay? And the result of not number is going to be true. So not number is true, okay? So now when you go in here, you can actually simplify this by saying, you can go ahead, let's go ahead and make some new lines here. Now we're going to say variable not number, or not number, let's make it simpler, not number type, right? Because the type is what we're checking. This is the condition that we want right here. Whoops. right here. This is the condition that we want from here to here. I'm going to just cut and paste that. I don't need this anymore. And now here I'm going to say variable not number equals isNaN, like that. Now let's think about this for a second, okay? If this is false, this check is false, is there a scenario that you can think of where the isNaN here could possibly be false, right? Because we already checked the type. This is like the hard check. You're checking the type of this is got to be a number, right? So if the type is a number, then the isNaN is always going to be false as well, because if it's not a number, because it's already passed the first check. So there really is no reason to go ahead and do both. But just for the sake of this example, say there was another way that I'm not thinking about right now for it to actually fail this check. So now we can put both checks into one. You know, if either of these are true now, we'll go and say if not number type or not number. So if either of these end up being true, and remember the result's a Boolean, so you don't need to say equal true and equal true, because just by the shortcut, you don't have to do that if Boolean, because in the end of the day this is looking for a Boolean, right? So you can just go ahead and do this like that, if not number type or not number, bam. So now you've simplified this function. You only have one if condition, and now finally if you do two numbers, the answer is 4. If this is not a real number, you're gonna say number 1 and number 2 must be valid. I'm gonna reverse it. If they're both not numbers, not valid. If this is a number and the other one's not a number, not valid. And if they're both numbers, you finally get your answer. Okay, so Scopes, I'm sorry, what was your question?
Well, it was like before. Do you know, like before we did all the hard code checks and we did the OR statement?
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna
Could
open
you
up the
also-
body of the function. Go ahead.
Could you also, as a check, instead of using OR, not saying that I wouldn't use OR, but could you not just do number 1 plus number 2, and if that isn't a number, like...
Oh, you
isn't
mean the
OR,
result?
Yeah.
You could do that too. So what you're saying is actually go ahead and do the operation like this.
Yeah, just
So
if
you
that's not a
actually
number, then
so
or-
so result, right, would be number 1 plus number 2, and then you can
Yep.
say, you know, if this is not a number, and we're just gonna use the type of. So now you can say if is gonna go all the way down here and say if result, if type of result is not a number, then we're gonna return that error, right? And otherwise we're just gonna console log the result instead. We don't have to do the operation again because we already have the answer. So essentially reversing it like that, and I'll explain why I don't generally do things that way. So that does work, and for this specific example, that's actually fine. There's nothing wrong with it at all, right? Because in this example, doing a number plus number 2 is not a big deal, and we could actually go ahead and test all these scenarios again from the beginning. If we do add 2 plus 2, number is not okay, wait, I did something wrong here. Oh, okay, this is supposed to be number 1, my bad. Okay, enter, let's fix that. Okay, so let's do that again. So 2 plus 2, 4. If one of these are wrong, it's gonna say not valid, right? So in the end of the day, input and output to this function with switching the logic the way Scopes just asked will give you the same result. Now the problem with doing it that way is, for this function is not a big deal because all you're doing is just adding one number to another number. Now typically, if you're thinking about it, is when you're writing like functions in JavaScript, typically the case is this is an operation, and this operation might not be as simple as number 1 plus number 2. Maybe this is something like, let's connect to a server to check for something, right?
Yeah,
you can't do that first if you don't validate it first. So you always gotta want to think about it as validation first, because in the end of the day, you want to avoid doing that final operation with invalid parameters, because depending on what that operation might be, this might be an error, right? In this case here, it's not, because you're just adding a number to another number, and the way JavaScript works is you're always going to have a result from doing something plus something, regardless of whether it's not what you wanted or not. But in a lot of different situations, maybe you're running another function that needs a parameter to be something specific in order for it to work, otherwise you get an error, right? So you don't even want to try to do it without validating everything first. So that's the reason why, although you can do this, validation should always come first.
Not good in all situations.
Right. Like, so validation
I
first covers every scenario, basically.
Just another quick thing. When you're using not a number, the check, can you do like checks inside of the quotation? So obviously you did not a number and then number one. Could you do the or inside of that as well? Or do you have to do it separately and do another not a number?
So you're talking about, like, if I did, like, not a number is not a number, and then do, like, 5 or a 6,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that?
Or could you do like number one or number two in that? Instead of
Well,
doing it's not a number.
in
number
the
one.
end of the day, so here's the problem. So doing, like, what you're doing here is you're actually, so to answer your question is no, you can't really do that.
Okay.
And the reason why, I'm just explain, I think it's important to understand the reason why, is that you're basically checking the result of 5 or 6, and the result of 5 or 6 is going to be true because you're just saying 5 or 6, right? So let's break it down. If you're doing 5 or 6, the result is 5, whatever, right? It's gonna, so if you're doing a Boolean operation here, like if you're doing a conditional, you're gonna get the results of a conditional. So if you're saying like this and this, like, the results are not really gonna be what you expect. And the way that JavaScript works is when you're inside of anything, so if you're doing is then, you're basically checking the result of this, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, right?
Okay.
So that's how it works. It's just the way that you write JavaScript. It's all nested. So like if we're doing add, right, you don't, although we can say 5 and 6, you could hypothetically do 5 plus 2. Now the result of 5 plus 2 is 7. And that's the only thing that goes into the function. So once it gets here, number one's going to be 7. Number one's not going to do 5 plus 7. I mean, I'm sorry, 5 plus 2. The 5 plus 2 will happen before the function's executed, right? So this happens first, then this happens. So in this case, 7 plus 6, 11. So or 13. You can't do math. And then there's your answer, right? So again, like, you know, so, and this is just general JavaScript. Anytime that you're putting more operations inside of something like this, it's going to translate to the result before running what it's trying to run. So that's an important thing to remember. So let's go back to the basic function syntax. Now that we've done all of this, and I don't know how well everybody's kept up, but like, let's just kind of break down the body of a function again, right? So again, so we're going to do variable, we're going to say my function 3, you know, it doesn't really matter, and we're going to use arrow again, arrow function like this, and we're going to have multiple parameters again. So param 1, param 2, param 3, param 4. And here we're just going to say console log, and here's another little trick, dot arguments. So dot arguments is just a shortcut that basically grabs all of your arguments together, right? So now if I do this and I run my function 3 and I don't pass anything, notice it says arguments not defined. If I pass something like this, it's also going to say arguments not defined. So the dot arguments didn't work over here. And I'm not sure why. Is it probably because this is an arrow function? I'm not sure. Let's see. Args dot arguments. Let's try that again. My function 3. Alright, so let's ignore. I try to simplify it by using this shortcut. I think this shortcut only works in class syntax, modern JavaScript. So it wouldn't work for what I'm trying to show you here, unfortunately. But we can just say param run. Whoops. This is the result that I expected to get from that anyway, which was param 1 is this. And we're going to copy and paste this 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. And 2, 3, 4. And this will be 2, 3, 4. So the main thing I want you guys to understand is And I think it made sense from the adding an example, but I'm just going to go over it again with just this in mind because I hadn't done that before. So the function is called my function. It has 4 possible parameters, and the way that you assign a value to these parameters, right, is by listing them when you call the function. You can call the function without any parameters and they're all undefined. If you assign 1 parameter, then your result, the parameter 1 is going to be that first thing that you sent, and the rest are undefined because you only specified 1 parameter. Now what's happening here, right, in the background, when you run this function, this is kind of like the same thing as whatever you pass in, right, in these parentheses. So say I passed in ASD blah blah blah. Think about it as if we were secretly doing an invisible var param1 equals whatever you passed in. Okay, so that's how you assign parameter values when calling a function, right? So this is how you do it. Like, so whatever you write here will become the value of this variable inside of your function body. So let's go ahead and do an example for all of them, right? So we're gonna say dog, cat, pig, and horse, and we'll do a 5th one too, bull. Okay, and we're gonna run the function. Now notice that there's no bull, right? And the reason why does this function know what a bull is? No, it doesn't, because the body of this function only has 4 parameters. So like, you can go in here and do param 5, it doesn't matter. Like, you have to assign it up here. And again, the whatever the name of these parameters, it's all up to you. If you call this animal, then when you refer to it, you have to use animal. If you call it param1, then when you're referring to it here, you have to call it param1, right? So in this example, I sent 5 parameters, but I've only declared 4 parameters, so it's going to translate it accordingly. Param1 is dog, param2 is cat, param3 is pig, param4 is horse. And this is essentially the fundamentals of how functions work in JavaScript. Now, just like everything that we've gone over in JavaScript, where an object can be inside of another object, which could be inside of an array, which could be inside of another array, which could be like all that, right? So it's the same thing with functions. A function is just another type of variable. Okay, so if you have an object, let's call it object equals let's call it animals, right? So we have an animals object, and we're going to open and close the now we've created an object called animals. Okay, and if you want to make a function called tell me my animals, this is the function. It's going to be an arrow function, and I'm not going to put any parameters here. I'm just going to say console log all my animals are, and then I'm not going to do anything yet. I'm going to leave this blank for now. But now I have a function in an object. So let's look at the object again. The object is just animals, and now I have this function in here called tell me my animals, and it's just a function. If I want to call that function, the way you reference that variable would be animals dot tell me my animals, right? So this is the function. But how do I wrote that wrong, didn't I? Yeah, I did. So that's the function. And if you want to trigger that function, or invoke that function is the word we use, you need to open close parentheses. And now we have to tell me my animals are. And just like that, you can assign parameters to the functions as well. So if I want to say animal 1, animal 2, and animal 3, and then here I'm going to say my animals are animal 1, comma, animal 1, animal 2, and animal 3. Okay, and now I'm going to run the function again, but now I'm going to actually say dog, cat, pig. So now it's going to say my animals are dog, cat, pig. This is no different at all than what we did up here with all these functions that we were testing. The only difference is these functions that we did before, they're all like a variable in the global syntax, in the global scope. They're all just a normal variable that I assign doing var the variable, and then I just assign a function to it. Like, so for the last one that I did here, I said var my function 3 equals that, right? Where the difference is here, I'm assigning that variable inside of an object. And you can put functions inside of objects, you can put functions inside of arrays. As long as you know how to reference them, you can invoke them however you want, right? And another thing too is you can call a function from within a function. So I can make a new function here, and I can say animals dot math, or animals dot math function. I can say add. Now I don't know if you remember, but add is our math function that we did before, and it still exists. I haven't deleted it, I haven't refreshed this page, so my function is still there. So I'm gonna say animals equals math function add. Now remember, this is a reference, right? So this is a reference to that same function. So if I go and rewrite add, I'm creating a new function and reassigning it. I think you guys remember that, the whole reference bit from the first session. I'm not gonna go over that again, but basically now I have animals dot math function, and I can go and say 2 and 5, and it's going to run that add function, because that's basically all it is. Animals dot math function is that same add function that we wrote before, right? That does what we did before, that we went over and did all the validation and all that stuff. So if I do add function and I do two things that don't exist, it's going to say number 1 and number 2 must be valid. It's what we did before. Now you can call a function from within a function. If I'm going to edit my tell me my animals function here, and under this I want to say add 3 and 4, 2 and 4, it will go ahead. So now if I run my tell my animals function, where is it? Right there. I'm doing dog, cat, and pig. It's gonna say all my animals are dog, cat, pig, and then it's gonna give me 6, because inside of that function I'm calling that add function with the values of 2 and 4. Does that. Now I think this is a good. We're getting close to the end of the hour, and I think the last thing I want to go over is the returns for functions. So before I get into returns, does this make sense to anybody? Does anybody have any questions so far? I'll take
Quick one.
Go ahead.
Is a negative number seen as a number? In
Yes.
just it's not stupid, right? It's not going to look at a hyphen and think it's a character, right?
No. So
Okay.
this is a negative number, right?
Okay,
It
good.
just counts as a normal number.
I was going to make sure it wasn't going to like say it's a string now because it's got a character and number or something.
No.
And you have
That's
to like
just,
make sure.
as long as you got that minus before it, it's just a negative number, just like any other number. But okay, so let's move on here, and let's cover the last bit of functions that you guys need to understand. And once we go over this, then the fundamentals of functions will be over. And of course, that doesn't mean you guys fully understand functions yet, but at least we would have covered everything there is to cover in these lessons. So now let's talk about the function return, and we're gonna refresh. We're gonna start over, clean slate. Right? Let me refresh this completely. All right, so all that shit that I did before is gone. The add doesn't exist. My function doesn't exist. It's all gone. Okay, this is all like fresh slate. There's no JavaScript in this document. So let's talk about what our return is. So the same way that you can assign a variable, and you can say var my variable equals, hair, whatever you want, right? You're giving a variable a value. Now, when you return a function, and this is very, very, very important to understand, because you're going to see this a lot in JavaScript, and I'll try to break it down in the end with an example. But in a function, so let's just say I'm going to say var function. No, I can't call it function. Func. Let's call it func. Okay, so var func, and this is a function that we're just going to call func. We'll use the K too. Why not? And we're gonna do an arrow function here, and I'm not gonna give it a parameter. I'm assuming at this point you guys understand how parameters works, right? In the end of the day, all parameters is just mapping out values to variables that you pass to the function. So to keep this simple, I'm not gonna use parameters. This is gonna be a function without any parameters, and here I'm going to return. So this is very important. I'm gonna return face. Okay, so func equals face. In the end of the day, this function is doing absolutely nothing except returning the word face. So now if I call this function like this, whoops, it's func with a K. Notice that on the bottom here it says face. Okay, if I assign a new variable, I'm going to call it var2. I'm just going to call it actually body part. My function, my variable is called body part, and I want it to be the result of func. Then body part. Now notice the difference. Okay, I am invoking the function with the open and close parentheses. So I'm saying the value of body part is the result of my function. There's a giant difference between doing var body part equals func. Okay, and I'll explain the difference. If I do var body part equals func, then body part is now that same function, and I can run body part to get the result of face. But if I say var body part is the result of func, then body part is face. It just gets that return response. It just basically takes the value of the function func after it's done running, and it returns me that value. Now, why is this something very important for you to understand? In JavaScript, you're going to see a lot of things happening after a function, and I'll show you an example. Now, let's just say, let's clear this example here, and let's go with another example. Now, let's just make a new function called get body parts. Okay, I'm going to stick to body parts here. But now I'm going to say return. Now, this function is going to return an array, and you guys are familiar with arrays. And I'm just going to name 3 body parts: arm, leg, and chest. Whoops. Oh god, tabs. Oh my goodness. Okay, let me do a new thing here. I should really like get in a habit of, I don't know why, I just don't like the tab spacing on the console, so I tend to use spaces. It just gets confusing. Anyway, so arm, leg, and neck. Okay, that's going to be the 3 body parts on my array that I'm returning as the result of get body parts. So when I run, what did I mess up? Oh, okay. Var get body parts equals arrow function. The way I declare this, you know what? I'm not gonna go into that class syntax. So I'm missing something. What am I missing? I'm doing equals. Say that again.
The equals for your arrow.
Oh, good call. There it is. Good call. That's what I was forgetting. So now if I do get body parts, right? Whoops. Get body parts, it's going to give me that array. Now, if you guys remember, you can do a lot of other things with an array. Like you can check what the array length is. So let's make a new array, right? A normal, just for comparison. Let's do another array, and I'm going to call this array body parts. Now, there's a huge difference, okay? One is a function, one is a variable. And I'm going to actually make it exactly, I'm going to make a different body part just so we can differentiate them easily. And I'm going to say, okay, so face, elbow, and knee. There. So these are different body parts. So get body parts is going to return arm, leg, and neck. And then body parts, like just like that, is going to return face, elbow, and knee. Right? Now, if with body parts I can do body parts dot length, I'm not going to write a map function, but I will show you that map is a function, right, that you can do with that array. So you know what, why not? I'm just going to say map part console log part. Takes 2 seconds, might as well do it real quick, right? So if I'm doing this map, we're iterating all the parts, right? Now this is the same thing for this function. The only difference is, and this is the big part, is you have to make sure that you include the open close parentheses, because you invoke the function and then everything that goes after this dot is what you do to the result of this function. So we're doing the get body parts function, and then we're running a map on the result. The result is an array, so you can do all the things that you would do to an array with the result of a function, because the result is in fact an array. So you can nest that, and that's what we call nesting. So you can simplify things a lot by understanding this concept with the value of a function. Now I hope that this is making sense. So now when you have now what are functions used for? So functions are basically just used to simplify your code. Let's think about an example scenario. Let me think of one real quick off the top of my head. So you might find yourself doing the same thing over and over again. Like, so say you're writing, let's use math again as an example. Say you have like a couple of different functions that you're trying to do for your, so say you're doing like a mathematical operation. So let's look at a calculator. You know what, instead of me writing this all from scratch, let's look at a calculator example. I'm actually open something that my wife had worked on quite some time ago when her and my daughter were working on a calculator when we did this in the past. Just give me a second to browse through these files here. It's a bit to get through. So personal, family, web development school, front end, first wave. I think it was day 10 homework. And okay, so there's her calculator. Okay, so we're just gonna look at the code here real quick. So instead of taking all of this time to write it out and explain it, I'm just gonna show you guys like an example. So here, notice that and we're not gonna get like, so I'm not gonna talk about listeners today, right? We're gonna talk about that in the next lesson. I was hoping we could get that today, but just think about, so this document query selector, as you guys should already kind of remember from the first JavaScript lesson we did, this is how you target an element in your JavaScript, right? So she's using this document query selector to target each individual button on her calculator. Like, so it's targeting the button, and then it's doing this add event listener click, and then it's assigning a function to the click. So this is essentially telling the button what to do when you click on it, right? And it's using, for all of these buttons, they're all using this function called work. I don't know why I just called it that, but I told them to call it the function whatever they want, but she called this work. So if we look at what this function is doing, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit here. Hope that that's easier to read. So for instance, all of these numbers, you see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all of these different buttons that she has here, all they're doing essentially is, and I'll show you right here with the console log, right? So this is the cool thing when you go to a web page that already has functions built in. So she has this work function here, so we can just test it here. So she does work 2. Notice that it puts a calculator and the number 2, and if you do work 5, it goes ahead and types in a 5. So work basically is her function that puts things in the calculator, right? And let's look at the code for work. Now they're all calling work because work is all kind of goes through the same process for every number, and that's why you use a function to do it instead. Because if you weren't, let me go back to Firefox. If you weren't using a function to do it instead, then all of these places here that you see work would have had to have all of this code here, but X would have been that number instead, right? Copy and paste it all over the place. So the only thing that's changing is the value of X. So she's basically just doing, if the input value is 0, the value of the input box is 0, it'll just say input value is X. So like the very first thing that this is doing, and I'm gonna just refresh this, is saying if the value is already 0, it's gonna leave it as 0, right? That's basically all it's doing. So that's what that first piece of code that she has is doing. The value, if the input value is 0, the input box, well, I'm sorry, if the input value is 0, then the input value will be whatever value you've pressed, right? And the reason why she does that, if it's a 5, you don't want it to be 5, 0, you want it to be just 5. And it works for 0 too, because you're basically just replacing the 0 with another 0, so every time you press it, it's going to have the same result, right? And if you're pressing a different number, it's replacing that number with that value. So then what's the next thing? What is the next? Oh my god. Okay, so what's the next thing that it does? So I'm not going to get into the logic of this calculator, but it's saying otherwise. So only in an if this is not the case, right? Because you remember the difference between with an else if and all that we talked about. It'll check this type of stuff, and we're not going to go over whatever. But then it'll say input value equals x, memory 2 equals memory. Otherwise, input value plus equals x, and plus equals, this is just string concatenation. I don't know if you guys remember the shorthand that I explained. If you have a variable, like let's just call it word, and it's an empty string, if you do word equals word plus happy, right, now the word is happy. If you do word plus word space face, now the value of word is happy face. We did it with math, but it's the same thing for string concatenation. And then now if you can use this shorthand plus equals to just add to the word happy face something, right? And now the word is happy face something. So that's basically what's going on here. So this work function is only really meant to add things to the calculator as you click on it. And again, we're not going to go over the whole thing of this. If you guys want me to send you this file so you can look at it, if you're interested in how this calculator works, I can send it to you. Kaylin, my daughter, did one as well. It's let me see if it's the same thing essentially. The code is roughly the same. In fact, I remember Kaylin helping Floor with a lot of those functions and helping her get her calculator working, you know. So but they're both calculators are both work. They both are coded pretty much exactly the same way. But here's another example of like combining JavaScript and HTML to make something work on a web page. And the keyword here, and the point of why I'm showing you guys this, is that what you see a lot of is functions, because every time that you're going to do something more than once, you need a function. So say clear this is happening here, clear is happening here, you know, so it's happening in multiple places. Like you don't have to copy and paste that code everywhere you want to make that happen. Set operation, you could just copy and paste, so it's looking every time that there's an operator, we use that set operator function, operation function, because the set operation is what it does. A couple of things. It clears these memory values, it changes this value, and it changes the value of the operation. So instead of having these 4 lines every single time with different values, you just write a function to do all those things instead, and so on and so forth. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it up with that example. So this essentially, let's go back to my thing here. I don't think I have it open anymore. It doesn't matter. But let's go back here. And I know that I had said on the end of the last session that I'm going to go over, like, I'm using maps on this stuff. Now, I forgot that I wanted to cover functions first. It was important because functions were like the last missing piece of all the different types of JavaScript things that we were talking about, except class, but we're going to cover class later. Class is not crazy. I think it'll be very easy for you guys to understand that when we get to it. But the main thing is now I think for the next lesson, what we're going to do, and let me confirm that that's what I have here with my notes real quick. Yeah. So the next lesson, we're going to actually start playing around with some of these, with what you see on your HTML document, kind of like what Nora did here, right? But we're gonna get deep into how you can use JavaScript to manipulate your HTML, and we're gonna do a lot of things here. Like there's animations, there's all kind of stuff that I had set up here. I don't know if you guys remember. Like I think that I have this span over here set up that if you change the font size, like if I change this to like 100 pixels, it'll animate, right? So you can do that with JavaScript, right? So this is a span, and I think that this is the only span on this page. So I can target this span by saying document.query selector span, like that. So that's the span, and now I can edit the style, and I can change the font size to whatever I want it to be. I can set it to 10 pixels again, and it'll animate. So essentially I'm animating that like with a combination of JavaScript and CSS. So if you think about it, you can have a button. So there's this button right here. You can make it so when you click on this button, it'll go ahead and animate whatever you want to animate. Now, obviously, this is just a very weak example, but this gives you an idea of the different things you can do once you start combining the power of CSS and JavaScript to manipulate your HTML document. And I'm assuming by now when I say HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, everybody here knows exactly what I'm talking about and what the three different things are and what they're used for. And that's, if you think about it, before the first lesson, you guys didn't know what any of that shit was. I think most of you guys didn't, right? So that's a pretty big accomplishment to be able to look at look at any web page now. Like, let's go to let's see, YouTube. Let's go to YouTube, right? So you can look at YouTube now, and you can understand. I thought I put my phone on silent. Sorry about that. You can look at YouTube and you can understand that what's happening here, what you're looking at visually, is an HTML document where, like, let's go ahead and inspect some of this stuff, where it's just a collection of. Now, this looks very different than what you guys are used to, right? Because there's a lot of SVGs, and YouTube is like pretty advanced with the design. But if you go a little deeper, you can kind of see things that look a little more familiar. You have anchor tags, you have your divs, you understand, all in all, regardless of what they're calling their elements, you understand that these are all HTML elements, and they have their attributes, and you get that none of this is CSS, and you get that you can go and look at their CSS file. So like right here, it tells you like what line on what CSS file it is. So this is their CSS files, and this is all CSS. And anything else, like you can look at the I'm trying to remember. So you could go ahead and look at your debugger and look at all their JavaScript libraries as well. And all of this stuff over here is all going to be JavaScript code. Now, obviously, I don't expect you to go through YouTube and understand how their web page is put together 100%. But the most important thing is you understand the different pieces, like the three major things and what they are opposed to each other, right? HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You get it. And that's very, 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 very important to understand and determine the difference from those things. So anyway, I think this wraps up this lesson. I'll open up one last time for questions if anybody has any questions. I forgot to keep looking at the chat throughout this whole thing. I told myself I'm going to look at the chat. I'm glad nobody asked any questions throughout the session this time because I didn't pay attention to the chat at all. But that's it. So does anybody have any questions as we begin to wrap this up now? And I'll take that as a no. So no questions. Hopefully you guys really do understand functions a little better. And if you have any questions like that you can come up with between this session and next session, feel free to use that questions channel on our Discord. It's pretty empty right now and boring. Nobody's asked me anything over there yet. And that's it.
We do it mainly in like PMs.
Yeah, I know. Everybody just ends up asking me individual questions. It's not a big deal. As long as I'm like, I like getting questions because when you guys are asking me stuff, I feel like you're actually trying to understand it, I'm not saying that if you're not asking me questions, oh my goodness, you're not trying to understand it. I'm not saying you're not trying to understand it, but by you guys engaging and asking me questions, I know where you're at, and that helps me help you better through these lessons, right? So one thing that John had asked about a couple of days ago is like he wants to work on that website for his plumbing company, and that's great. So one thing that I put on my notes that I will cover soon, eventually, I don't have a date for it yet. It's going to depend on how long it takes to cover some of this other stuff, but I'm going to explain how you can actually make a website live. Like if you want to have a .com out there and put it out there, I'll just give you a brief overview and a couple of different examples on how you can get this stuff out there. So if you have a website and you have a domain, you want to go ahead and put it where people go to the domain and they see your website. It's actually pretty easy to do, like a lot easier than everything we've gone over so far. So anyway, wrapping it up here. And I will see you guys next time, which will probably be on Saturday at 5. That might change. we'll see. But Saturday 5 p.m. Eastern is what we're probably gonna shoot for. But if it changes, just catch the video on Twitch or on YouTube after it's published. Have a good one, everybody.